All right, welcome everybody to the Panda Security webinar on what is threat hunting and why do you need it. My name is James Manning. I am a pre-sales engineer here for Panda Security North America, and I will be your presenter today. Well, apparently threat hunting is a pretty popular topic, judging by the interest that we've seen expressed towards this particular presentation. So hopefully we will be able to do the topic justice with you today. You'll leave here just a little bit wiser. Maybe we have a couple of surprises in store for you. Just a couple of notes on housekeeping before we get too far in. As we always say, as far as interaction goes today, you will not be able to speak with me directly and ask questions directly during the presentation or at the end. But on your interface there, your webinar interface, you should have the ability to enter in questions, and we recommend that. So as you have questions and we go throughout the presentation, go ahead and throw those in there for us. And at the end, we are going to reserve a few minutes, and we're going to go over any of the questions that we may have received. If we don't get to everything, we'll reach back out to you as well. I'll also be putting my contact details up at the end, so you'll have the ability to get in touch with me directly. So let's get started. A quick look at our agenda today. We're going to take a look at first, what is threat hunting? Always good to have a definition. Why is it becoming popular? What are some of the challenges related to threat hunting? Panda's this, or THIS, which we will explain more. Practical case example, and as we always like to do, we're going to wrap it up with a little bit of a summary, and then as mentioned, we will have a bit of a Q&A session there towards the end. So let's dive right in and start off with what is threat hunting. It's always good to be on the same page whenever we're talking about a topic. So let's look at a sort of borrowed definition here. I'll summarize it a bit, but threat hunting is the process of proactively and iteratively searching through networks to detect and isolate advanced threats. In contrast to traditional threat management measures, which typically involve an investigation after there has been a warning of a potential threat or an incident has occurred. Now, we've highlighted those two words there, proactively and after. Interestingly enough, if you've been on my webinars before, you've heard me kind of beat that into the ground, you know, the idea of being proactive. So it's definitely a thread that seems to be running through an InfoSec community as a whole, but also the products. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that today. Now, some of the kind of key concepts that we're going to get out of that definition, but also out of threat hunting as a whole. Like we said, it is a proactive versus a reactive approach to threats. Threat hunting is not incident response, but they are connected. So when we talk about threat hunting, what we're not talking about is when you get an alert that says, hey, you've had this detection in this location. It doesn't mean that you're going back or confirming it. You're seeing, you know, what else it did, maybe how far it spread and so on. That's incident response. We're not talking about that. Threat hunting is something different entirely, but they are connected. Threat hunting typically leads into incident response. Also, threat hunting covers what the tools in place cannot see. And that's the whole idea of it. You'll have your IDS, you'll have your firewalls, you'll have your EDR in place, your data integrity solution. The idea of threat hunting is to get in there and to look in areas where these tools cannot cover. Also, and very important, I think it's very important for us to mention this, is that it is not a replacement for all of those other strategies, for any of those other strategies. Especially such as threat detection. There's a tendency, and we saw this really as we started to see the move from traditional AV into things like EDR and so on. Some people tried to take the jump that, well, I have an EDR solution. I don't need traditional AV. I don't need the remediation in there, which wasn't true. So the same, you know, holds true here. If you're to implement something like threat hunting, it doesn't mean that you can, you know, reduce your budget and get away with everything else. It's an augmentation of kind of what you're already doing, and we'll go into a lot of detail about why on that. Just to give you kind of a really clear picture of what we're talking about, we're going to use a contrast that Gartner provided on threat detection and threat hunting by Anton Chvakin He was actually the one that also created the definition for EDR itself. But if we look at the process for just sort of a typical approach to threat detection, what we see is that one of the first steps is that we're trying to go out and deploy some sort of detection context. This is usually made up of rules and algorithms. It's a fancy way of saying, think of like an EDR or a traditional AV. You've got a signature file, you got heuristics and so on and so forth. You're putting that package out there. Then what you're doing is you get into a little bit of a reactive state. You're waiting to receive alerts when anything in those rules and algorithms is matched in the environment. When that happens, this isn't always a step in the process, but sometimes you go into a phase of triaging the alerts. What is the most severe? What has the widest impact? Is this a false positive? So on. And then from there, it all moves into incident response. Threat hunting is very different. So what we're doing is we are actually starting with the formulation of a hypothesis. And several things can feed this hypothesis, several different approaches to doing this. You may take a target-based approach. In other words, you may say that these are my assets in the business. These are what are most important to us. These are what I have to protect. And this is how I would try to attack those, or what I think somebody would try to do to attack those. Or you may take an attacker approach. You may say, all right, well, I'm going to look for traces of, let's say, Emotet. It's a banking Trojan. It does X, Y, and Z, and let me see if I can find these conditions in the environment. That kind of approach. Or it may be a nation state or sort of an attack, a hacking group that you're looking at. So you're taking that kind of information and you're formulating a hypothesis. You're saying that based on this data, I think I would see this kind of information or this kind of activity in my environment or in the data from my environment. You take that hypothesis, you use your tools, you go back in and you look to see if you can find it in the environment itself. Now, if you don't, you circle back around. You go back and you reformulate your hypothesis or you create a new one. However, if you do find it in the environment, your hypothesis has been proven, and from there you pivot and you start to expand the scope. All right, I found these indications of it from my hypothesis, but how much more is involved? What else did I not know that's related to this? From there, you take all that information and it also shifts over into incident response, but you're also having the ability to create a whole new detection context that you can use automatically the next time around. So there's the big difference. You see, with threat detection, we're putting something out in play and we're just kind of sitting back and waiting, and if we get an alert, we need to go take care of it. Threat hunting, we're coming up with an idea, scientific method. We're going to look and say, I think I found this. Then we're going to be proactive. We're going to go in and we're going to jump in and look to see if we could find it anywhere, and we're going to keep doing this process over and over and over. So why is it becoming popular? If we want to talk about, let's talk about just the workload. When you look at this, wouldn't it seem like it would be a lot easier to just throw threat detection in there, sit back and wait, than go through all of this threat hunting, formulating a hypothesis, spending time looking for it. Well, if I didn't find it, I got to create a new one, going and looking for it. Now I got to expand out and then see what the scope is, and then I get all this data over to incident response. It's a lot of work. So why is it becoming popular? And this is important because I didn't say new. This is not a new thing. Threat hunting has been around for a while, but it seems to have sort of pushed its way towards center stage as of late. So we want to talk about why that is the case. And I think there's several reasons for this. One of the first ones, here's that thread again. We have our proactive trends. As we've said, this is something that you've seen it run throughout my presentations because I've seen it run throughout the industry. We see it in a couple of different areas that we can mention here. One is in solutions. We have the transition from endpoint protection platform, traditional AV, over to EDR. So reactive to proactive, something saying that, well, I don't have you in my list, so you're okay, to a solution that's saying, well, I don't have the data that says that you're not okay, but I'm going to go get it and make sure. I'm going to find out. So we have proactive to reactive as far as securing the endpoints. We can also talk about phishing. It used to be you would bang your head against the wall trying to educate your users. Don't click on these links. Don't look for this, look for that, and over and over and over. to now they have actually really produced solutions that you're able to utilize and go out and fish your own employees. You can fish your employees and see who's going to take the bait, you know, where your weak spots are, and kind of shore that up. So going from a proactive to a reactive state there. Also in general practices, this has been a little bit more of a longer trend. I can't in any way say that this is something new, but instead of taking kind of a passive wait and see approach with the holistic environment itself, we're talking about your network and so on. You have organizations that actually engage in penetration testing. So it's like, I'm not going to sit back and wait and say, oh, look at that, we've been breached, and then wonder why and try to figure it out. I'm going to set it up as best as I can, and I'm going to go out and get a firm and say, hey, get into my network, let me know where my failure points are so I can resolve it. Some people even have in-house teams that do this for them as well. So people are really taking security seriously in all facets. We see that with the solutions, we see that with practices. They're realizing that they have to be proactive. Valuable traces. There's some obvious points to this, but there's some other important ones as well. So when you're going to look for these things, when you're formulating hypothesis and you're trying to look and you expand that scope, the attacks leave behind valuable traces. We're talking about, of course, successful attacks, but also failed attacks. You start looking at probes and everything as well. Number one, those probes, those failed attacks are going to let you know that, hey, somebody's trying to get into the environment, obviously. Give you the ability to potentially go back and look and say, all right, well, here's how they're getting in. This is where they're pivoting. This is where they're setting up or trying to set up backdoors potentially, and so on. And you can shut those things down. But also, we're talking about your assets here. So let's say your company has their assets. It's your job to secure them, make them available, and you think you have a good grasp on what those are. The organization thinks they have a good grasp on what those are. So you've taken steps towards that end. Well, let's say through one of these probes or failed attacks, you find out that actually there's a whole other set of assets over here that are drawing attention that you had no idea had any value. So what it may have done has introduced to you another section or another sector, a set of data that you may need to further secure. So this may cause you to rework the whole network setup and reclassify the data as far as how it's handled, what your processes are, and everything. So there's a lot of value in that side of things. And of course, this is popular, gaining popularity just simply because breaches are expensive. When we talk about the U.S., the average cost of a breach is about $7.9 million, start to finish. The average cost globally is probably right around $3.8 million. What is kind of scary is that it takes an average of almost 200 days to identify a breach. And then as a result, which is not a surprise, the average span to contain a breach is about 70 days. So if you've had somebody in your network, they've breached your network and they've been in there for 2/3 of a year, it's not a surprise at all that, it's going to take you, more than 2 months to fully contain a breach. It's going to be a mess. They've been able to get in. They've got probably backdoors all over the place. They've probably siphoned all your data out. Who knows what else that they've been able to accomplish while they're there. So naturally, it's going to take some time to get rid of it. That leads into that $7.9 million cost for these breaches. So money is obviously an object. And this is kind of a good sign for us. We take a little bit of pride in this. Definitely Adaptive Defense 360 deserves a round of applause for some of this as well. But infections are dwindling. So if we look over the past several years, what we see is that 2016 had 40% fewer infections than 2015 from our labs. 2017 had a 70% improvement over 2015. And this year, we have seen next to 0 infections reported. So there's reasons behind this. Adaptive Defense 360 definitely has a big part to play in this, but also what we find is that skilled attackers are the new problem. So no longer is there's this kind of idea of let's create this monolithic monster application or malware that's going to go into the system. It's going to do absolutely everything for me. It's going to infect it by exploiting this vulnerability. When it gets in, it's going to change these things, infect these files, add myself to the address book, send myself out to everybody else so I can propagate, and then worm throughout the network and then siphon all this data out. That idea is kind of in the shadows. We're looking at that in the rearview mirror now. So what we're dealing at these days more often is skilled attackers. We're talking about people that are trained by governments, not just ours, but also others, security companies as well, and very simply criminal organizations. That has always been an undercurrent in pretty much everything that we have done. We're finding what they're engaging in is very targeted attacks. They make the less noise most often with proprietary malware. And oftentimes that malware may be a payload, may not be. But they're using also applications and goodware in order to fly under the radar. And the idea is, let me utilize the systems, let me utilize the applications that are trusted already to penetrate as far as I can into this network, maybe reach my target, do what I have to do. And it makes sense. If you think back over all the other webinars that we have had, how many times have we discussed the point that this is a big cat and mouse game? It's a chess game. So we were dealing with a large volume of malware, complex malware, and it was starting to strain the old systems, the traditional AVs. You put in place something like adaptive defense, EDR, process classification. Well, all right, well, now it's a lot easier to be able to get in there and detect something if it was even created 30 minutes ago. So that makes it more difficult. So the next move on the chessboard is to say, all right, well, what can I do without malware? Can I get into the system utilizing vulnerabilities, get a reverse shell maybe, utilize PowerShell, WMI, so on and so forth to get to what I need to do? These applications have all been classified most of the time, or people think that they're trusted applications. A lot of traditional AV are not going to flag those in any way. So we need an equivalent response to this type of activity. And that's where threat hunting definitely comes into play. Now, what are the challenges? So we've gone this far. We've taken kind of a good look at sort of what the landscape is doing as far as some of the threats that are out there. What are the challenges? And I'm not talking about the challenges as far as threat hunting itself is concerned. I'm not saying that you're going to have to go out and create a list that says, I need to learn how to do this. I need to learn how to identify this. That's part of it. But I'm talking about what are the challenges for you as an administrator to implement a program or a system that enables threat hunting in your environment. There's a couple main ones that we can discuss. I think the big one for a lot of people is going to be time. So are you in one of those organizations now? And a lot of you are, where you are not only the IT administrator, you're also the technician, you also serve as the CISO in that organization, you're doing all of these different things. You don't have enough time as it is to finish all of your products and take care of all your responsibility. In this situation, time is absolutely your enemy. That being the case, you're simply not going to have enough time to do effective threat hunting. Effective threat hunting, some of it is dealing with collecting a lot of data. So you need to be collecting data from endpoints, perimeter devices, whatever. You have to have time to create a hypothesis. That hypothesis has to be informed. And then you have to actually engage in the process of trying to go out and validate your own hypothesis. We talked about informing your hypothesis. Well, time is needed for research, and research is part of that process of creating your hypothesis. Like we said before, there's a couple of different ways that you can go about creating a hypothesis based on target or based on attack. You may utilize indicators, such as indicators of attack, indicators of compromise. Some people will say no to that one. You also may have to look at attacker patterns. This may be a simple file or a malware family. It may be a hacker group as far as profiling them and understanding how they typically get into an organization recently. So you need that time to stay abreast of all of these different types of approaches. The second part of this is going to be resources. We're talking about tools and budget. So tools, let me preface this by saying there are absolutely open source tools that are out there that will probably become more, but maybe you're not an open source guy. That may not be the path that you want to take. But there's also data collection. So a SIM, getting data from your endpoints, so on and so forth, a lot of data that you got to collect, being able to get what you need, get that implemented. And then we're also talking about the budget. If you're not that open source guy, it's not the path that you want to take, you're going to have to go out and purchase these tools. And if you are one of those guys that do not have the time, you don't have the resources to actually sit there and create hypotheses and validate them and send them off and create detection contacts, you need a team. And a team is going to take money. So it's going to be an impact potentially on your budget. But then a very big point to talk about is incident response. What does your incident response look like now? Do you even have one? Is it, oh, I got an alert. Oh, well, okay. I'll worry about that later. If that's the case, you might as well not even bother getting into threat hunting. Because what is the point of having all this data, being able to identify these things going on in your network or have gone on in your network, if you have no mechanism or you have no ability to respond to that information? It's no different than knowing that your house is going to get broken into this weekend, but you're not going to have the ability to get out of the recliner. You're just going to sit there and watch them run around and pillage your house and take your information, your TV, your VCR, everything else out of your house. So it's the same thing. You need to be able to have an effective incident response to deal with what you find. And then the big elephant in the room, skills. Do you know what it is that you are looking for? It is great that you have mounds and mounds and mounds of data now. What does it mean to you? Do you know what you're looking at? And do you know what you're looking for? If not, you're going to waste even more time than you don't have. So what can you do? So maybe at this point, this idea of threat hunting is neat. It's something that you think could definitely benefit your organization. It's something you want to engage in. You understand the benefits and the idea of being proactive in your environment. So what can you do? If you don't have the time, the resources, or the skill, are you still able to benefit from threat hunting, or has that ship already sailed for you? So we want to talk to you now about something called Panda-the, Threat Hunting Investigation Service. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this slide, save for one point. I want you to keep in the front of your head that this service is provided with the base cost of Adaptive Defense 360. So this is not an additional fee. So the basis of our threat hunting investigation service is naturally our adaptive defense service. Adaptive defense is something that continuously monitors the endpoints, looking for security attacks by both inside and outside agents. Using that technology, we're able to find attackers that are not using malware. They're using PowerShell, they're using WMI, like I said before, other approaches. We're able to identify those things. The benefits, obviously, hacker detection or skilled attacker detection, as I said before, utilizing next-gen or malwareless attacks, getting into a network, pivoting or lateral movements and being able to move around, but also identification of malicious employees. I can't tell you the number of times we've encountered situations where there have been malicious employees that have tried to sabotage a network or tried to open a network up because they were disgruntled on the way out, whatever it may be. So that's always a threat as well. So how do we go about doing this? Where do we find the attack? Well, the data is very important. And I think the data in this is even a differentiator from what you could potentially implement on your own. Right now, we're getting endpoint data, endpoint telemetry from every single device that has Panda Adaptive Defense 360 installed. That creates an enormous bed of data for us to go through and analyze and look for events. This is magnitudes beyond what you could do if you were collecting every bit of data from your own single network. We're able to throw all this information and look at it globally for threats. So just as we saw with our method, we are going through and we are generating a hypothesis using the event stream from our install base, looking at event storage. We're looking at historic timelines. Doing that, we continue through the process. If we validate a hypothesis, we go and we create detection context, and then we can set those up for triggers in the system that gets fed into our kind of our threat engine. And then we go through after that trigger has happened, and we are able to confirm the incident has occurred, and then we work with or notify the customer that this has been the case. So let's take a look at some of the telemetry, and this kind of highlights exactly what I was talking about. Some of the main events that we gathered, and to be very clear, these are not the only events that we gather, but these are important ones. When it comes to the process, we're looking at creations, we're looking at injections, we're talking about files, obviously creations, file modifications, opening of files, communications related to IP addresses, origin and destination, downloads, registry creation, modification, administrative actions such as installs of the service, turning it on and off. So over the past 12 months, just a few of the numbers, 4,000 million events processed daily. And that's what I'm talking about. I don't think that you could get that level of telemetry in a single network. We have over 500,000 million events stored. We've already created 500 detection contexts. Remember we talked about the whole process with threat hunting. If you go through and you validate your hypothesis was correct, you expand it out and you look at the scope, and then from there, you shuffle it off to incident response, but you also create your detection context. So we have over 500 of those already created, over 4 billion applications profiled, 2.5 billion workstations profiled, and so on and so forth. So you see the magnitude of what we are able to work against as compared to what you would normally be able to work against in a single environment. So that's kind of the steam behind the engine here. Let's take a look at an example that has actually taken place. This one is called Bondat. We're going to look at the study process, formulation of the hypothesis, and then the investigation, so you can get an idea of what goes on. So threat hunting, Bondat, the invisible worm. So one of our expert threat hunters takes a look at the Bondat family. They start looking at the different characteristics. And what they start to find from this family, what they discover, is that overall this is a worm. It's written in JavaScript or VBScript. We see that it is typically spread by removable drives, pin drives, hard drives, and so on, by creating link files, LNKs. It is placed in the startup of the system, obviously. We're trying to get persistence, apparently. There's a CNC server, command and control server, that updates the code. It utilizes anti-debug, anti-virtual machine, and anti-emulation measures. These are all designed to prevent analysis. It is highly obfuscated in the latest versions, another attempt at preventing analysis. Using all of these things, it is very difficult to detect statically. It spreads through the network very quickly, and it's very difficult to disinfect after it has spread. So our threat analysts, they've done this study. These are the characteristics that they're finding. They create their hypothesis. So they generate that hypothesis based on potential communications with a CNC server. That's one that I'm going to look for. The next is I want to look at the type of concealment and the type of execution that this engages in. That'll be my next characteristic. And then using this activity, I've come up with a group of events that I think that I'll be able to find. So that's going to be my next characteristic. They plug that in to the system. They start looking around to see if they can validate that hypothesis, and they do. What they actually see is they find the worm downloading and running PowerShell or PowerShell scripts. And actually, remember we talked about expanding that scope. We validated the hypothesis, let's expand the scope, let's see what is happening now. This activity of downloading and running PowerShells is new. This is not something that is seen before. It is brand new functionality. We also see it downloading JavaScript, and then interestingly enough, it's downloading the PHP interpreter, querying another web page, and getting new code to execute. So we're able to validate that in the environment. So now we start digging a little bit deeper. So the attacks that were found. Knowing the CNC communication details, it was possible to pose as an infected machine and collect the last payloads that the attackers were launching. We validated, we saw the activity in the environment, and we said, oh, okay, so I can pose as a machine this way, contact that CNC of whose data I have, and act like an infected machine. I'll capture everything that it sends down and further build out my awareness of this threat. We find out that what it was trying to do was brute force on a list of sites with WordPress, and the idea was to Trojanize those WordPress sites. Very common. Once that happens, they're trying to download and install miners, crypto miners. We've already talked about those for economic gain. And additionally, it engaged in a denial of service for the NRA site, the National Association of the American Rifle, or National Rifle Association of America. So we've gone almost from start to finish. We looked at a threat family. We did an attack-based hypothesis. Based on its characteristics, we created that hypothesis. We looked in our system. We were able to find it. We expanded the scope, and we see what it was doing. We find the attacks in our system, and then we use that information to generate new indicators of attack. These are those detection contexts as well. We take that information saying, hey, now we know that it's pulling down PowerShell. Now we know it's pulling down the PHP interpreter and doing DOS and crypto miners and so on. Let's feed this back into the system. These are automated threat detections. And then, of course, what's very important and very relevant to you, incident notification to the customer. We've seen this in our global environment. We identified it in a specific site. We're able to go back and work with that customer and say, we've seen this activity in your environment. This is the way that it's taken place. Customers then able to take that information, remediate any issues that they may have in their environment, prevent these attacks from happening again in the future. So that was our example. Let's wrap it up here a little bit with our summary. A little bit unusual with our summary today. Normally we have a couple of points and we will get to that, but I wanted to point something out that I think is very important as well. And this is according to Gartner. And Gartner says organizations should pay particular attention to solutions that include managed services like threat hunting or file classification. Two things, threat hunting and file classification, particular attention. So Panda Security's value proposition is the classification or attestation of every single executable file and process on a protected endpoint device. There's that file classification. And it is the only vendor to include a managed threat hunting service in the base purchase of its platform. There's the threat hunting. So what Gartner says that you should pay particular attention to, we are providing to you as part of the base purchase of our Adaptive Defense 360 platform. So now our tried and true 3 final points as we wrap up. Summary, malware is not the only problem to solve. As we see, we're getting dwindling numbers. And what we're finding in their big cat and mouse game is that the focus is shifting to include real-time attacks and hackers. They're getting more skilled. They're using legitimate, trusted applications, penetrate as far as they can, compromise what it is that they're after. Attackers are evolving and adapting to tools and services, meaning solutions that you have deployed and put in place. So continuous analysis via threat hunting is the solution, or is the response to this issue. And then finally, and most important, Panda's Adaptive Defense 360 platform provides all of this to you just by installing the protection. And with that, we will open the floor up to any questions. So Larry Hall starts off and asks, what is the cost difference between endpoint protection and adaptive defense? Larry, we will get a sales rep in touch with you. I'm just a sales engineer. They only let me push buttons and turn knobs. They don't trust me with those sorts of things. So I will definitely get somebody in touch with you to give you an idea, give you a breakdown of what we're discussing. Okay, Brent, very good question. I meant to mention this and I didn't. I'm very glad that you asked this. So the question is, as an 8360 customer, do we need to request this service or is it already turned on? Fabulous point. No, you don't need to do anything. Just by purchasing the service, installing it, it is done automatically. There's nothing special that you have to do to enable it, request it, anything like that. So another question, what is the difference between adaptive defense and endpoint? Do they have similarities? Yes, they do have similarities. Uh, Endpoint protection is our traditional AAV, or EPP as they'll call it. It is more of a signature-based protection. That is also included in adaptive defense. The big difference with adaptive defense and endpoint protection is the managed service, the process attestation classification, every process classified on the machine. If you like, what we'll do is also, as far as the difference between the two, we'll send some data over to you that'll kind of further sort of illuminate that for you. All right, everyone, if there are no more questions, we will go ahead and wrap it up here. Like I said, my information is on the screen right now. Feel free to jot that down and email me a question if it comes to mind after you jump off. We thank you very much for attending. We hope this was informative for you. And again, if you have any questions, you want any more information, please feel free to contact us. Contact myself, contact your sales rep, and we'll be happy to work with you and provide you with anything that you needed. Again, thank you again for attending.